Hello, I'm LeRoy Anthony Peters. I'm an author for Dusty Saddle Publishing, and I will be reading the foreword introduction to my first book, my new series, The Frontier, Face of the Sun. So here it goes. For Face of the Sun, The Frontier, Book One by LeRoy A. Peters. Foreword. Lazarus Buchanan was a trapper's trapper, a man's man. If he was your friend, then you had a friend for life. But if he was your enemy, then may God have mercy on your soul. Respected by the tribes, both friend and foe, Lazarus was no run of the mill mountain man. Years of trapping, hunting, and living in the northern Rockies hardened him and made his senses acute, which have earned him well as one of the most successful and legendary mountain men. This is his story. Introduction. May of 1822, near Silver Bow Creek, Montana. Lazarus Buchanan sat cleaning his Harpers Ferry rifle. It was one of the two rifles that he personally owned. The other was a Pennsylvania rifle, also known as the Kentucky Long Rifle. He and his 9-year-old son Amos just returned from a hunt earlier that morning. He made it a habit of checking and cleaning his weapons before and after a hunt. As he sat outside the cabin, he shared with his two wives, who were gutting and cleaning the elk that he and their son just brought in. Darkwind, who was Flathead Indian, was Amos's mother and had been happily married to Lazarus for 11 years. Mountain Flower was Nez Perce Indian and mother of Lazarus' 3-year-old twin sons, Nicodemus and Joseph, and had been married to Lazarus for 10 years. The trapper paused for a minute as he watched his wives and mothers of his children work on the elk carcass. Most of the meat will be hung in the smokehouse that he and his uncle built along with the cabin that he now shared with them. Uncle Amos. Lazarus thought about him a lot. He met his demise at the hands of a Blackfoot lance 9 years ago, just a few months after young Amos was born. Lazarus owed a lot to his maternal uncle. It was he who brought his nephew out west to become a trapper and a mountain man 12 years ago when Lazarus was just 16. Now 28 and an experienced mountain man, Lazarus took the lessons taught to him by his beloved uncle about the ways of the frontier. These lessons not only helped Lazarus to survive, but also showed him something else: true grit. Even though there were no guarantees that a man would survive the frontier with all its dangers, from unpredictable weather to wild animals, such as the dreaded grizzly bear, hostile Indians like the Blackfeet, and even other trappers who would rob you and slit your throat in the process. Lazarus knew tougher men who had either quit the mountains like John Coulter because he could no longer deal with the dangers, or men who had succumbed to it like his Uncle Amos. With summer around the corner, it would be time to travel to St. Louis. Lazarus and his family often did that in summer to sell their pews and resupply for the next two trapping seasons. He often thought about his life over the past 12 years and how far he had come. Wow, has it been 12 years already? He thought to himself. I remember it as if it was yesterday. He went to check his son's rifle to see if he cleaned it thoroughly while memories flowed through his head. Chapter 1. The Visitor. Lazarus John Buchanan was born on New Year's Day, January 1st, 1794, in Dover, Delaware. He was the third of four children and the youngest of Peter and Lydia Buchanan. His parents were Scottish immigrants from the Highlands of Scotland, from the town of Inverary. Peter Buchanan was a successful shoemaker or cordwainer, while Lydia's father, Angus McKinnon, was a professional boxer who traveled up and down Great Britain making his living as a fighter. Angus McKinnon was a giant at 6 feet 10 inches tall and weighed over 300 pounds. He was surprisingly agile for a man his size. He won more fights than he lost and was careful with his money. Unlike most fighters like him, he retired from boxing and settled in Inver with his wife Murron and their two children, Lydia and Amos. When Peter decided to uproot the family from Scotland to America, Angus, now a widower of 3 months, decided to accompany his daughter and her family. He wasn't alone. Amos, who was still a teenager and close to his father, decided that there was nothing left in Scotland for him either, since his mother's passing. Peter thought it was an excellent idea to have his father and brother-in-law come with the family to start a new life in America, since they were already close to his sons, Peter Jr. and Paul. Not long after settling in the state capital of Dover, Peter Buchanan immediately set up shop and started his cordwainer business. 1 year later, Lydia would have Lazarus, who'd be the first member of their family from either side to be born in America. Now, while Lydia was brunette, as was her husband and late mother, both her father and brother had sandy white hair. One of Out of all the four Buchanan children, Lazarus would inherit his maternal grandfather's genes, not just having white sandy hair, but by the time he was 16 years old, he was already as tall at 6 feet 6 inches and weighing 260 pounds. Angus McKinnon loved being a grandfather and doted on his grandchildren, more so than his daughter and son in law. When Peter and Lydia welcomed their only daughter, Leah, in the spring of 1796, to say that the retired Scottish boxer was overjoyed would be an understatement. Amos McKinnon was just 14 years older than his nephew Lazarus. Like his father, he doted on his nephews and now niece and tried to set a good example for them. But he was restless and never really felt accepted in the community, mainly because of his Scottish accent and background. In 1798, when Lazarus was 4, Amos joined the army, much to the chagrin of his sister. It would be over 10 years before the family would ever see him again. Expelled? Shouted Peter Buchanan. It was the middle of January 1810. Lazarus had just turned 16, but this was not a celebration. How do you get expelled at the beginning of the semester? He was fighting again. Lazarus was standing in the middle of the kitchen with his head bowed. His parents both looked like they were about to pop a blood vessel. His grandfather, Angus, just sat quietly listening. This is the fourth time you've gotten in trouble for fighting, Lazarus, shouted Lydia in her thick Scottish brogue. What do you have to say for yourself? He had it coming, Lazarus answered. Don't you get smart with your mum, said Peter Buchanan, or I swear I'll pup you. Take it easy, Peter, said Angus. Ever since the boy and his older brother started walking, their grandfather taught them how to fight and never backed down from bullies, despite their parents' reservations. While Peter Jr. and Paul were even-tempered men and were not above finding ways to avoid a fight, Lazarus was hot-tempered, and while he didn't go looking for trouble, he never backed down from it, especially if that trouble was coming from Marcus Rhodes. Tell me, said Grandpa Angus, is that Marcus Rhodes going to be expelled? It doesn't matter, Da, said Lydia. It does if he was the one who started the fight, said Grandpa Angus. That spoiled rich brat has made Lazarus' life a living hell ever since you two enrolled him in that uppity private school for the rich, elite, spoiled brats. You are not helping the situation, Da, said Lydia. Besides, that's not the only reason he was expelled, added Peter. Grandpa Angus had a look of confusion on his face. Poor Miss Howard would be lucky if she could see it out of her right eye again, said Peter. You hit your teacher? Exclaimed Grandpa Angus. It was an accident, Grandad, said Lazarus. Just how do you accidentally hit your teacher? Asked Lydia. Lazarus just shrugged. She got in the way, I guess. Angus McGinnon guffawed. Not wanting to face his wife's wrath, Peter Buchanan managed to stifle a chuckle. You think this is amusing, Da? Asked Lydia. A little bit. At that moment, there was a knock on the front door. 14-year-old Leah Buchanan went to answer it and was greeted by her two eldest brothers, 21-year-old Peter Buchanan Jr. and 20-year-old Paul Buchanan. Peter Jr. had followed his father's footsteps into the cordwainer business, while Paul had gotten married last summer to a farmer's daughter and became a farmer himself. The two men, guided by their baby sister, entered their parents' home, while the youngest brother was still getting a tongue lashing from their mother. We heard, said Peter Jr. It's all over town. Well, that's just great, said Lydia, with her hands in the air. Peter Jr. and Paul had always defended their little brother, especially since 100% of the fights he was involved in, he didn't start, but he always finished. However, the look on their mother's face told them to keep their mouths shut. So what are we going to do? Asked Lydia. I think I have a solution, said Peter. Until we can find another school for Lazarus that will take him in the fall, I believe he should get himself a job. I agree, said Grandpa Angus. The lad can help me train some of these young pups at my gym. Not what I had in mind, Angus, said Peter. The family patriarch turned to his second-born son. Paul, is Rebecca's father hiring? Rebecca was Paul's wife, and her father owned a pig farm on the outskirts of the city. The lad is no farmer, Peter. Haven't you caused enough problems, Da? Said Lydia. You're lucky your poor mum isn't here to hear you talk to me that way. Otherwise, she would pop you good. If she knew what a bad example you set for our son, she wouldn't, said Peter. Granddad's not a bad example for me, said Lazarus, and I don't want to work on no pig farm. Oh, you don't, do you? Said Peter. And since when did you have a choice in the matter? Maybe next time you will follow the example of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and turn the other cheeks, added Lydia, instead of using your fists to solve your problems. There was a knock on the front door. I'll get it, said Leah. Who would be visiting us at this time of day? Asked Grandpa Angus. Leah suddenly returned to the kitchen with a confused look on her face. What is it, Lass? Asked her father. There's a man at the door dressed in weird clothing, Da, answered Leah. He say that he is my Uncle Amos. It can't be, shouted Lydia. Grandpa Angus immediately leaped up from his chair, but then regretted it, forgetting that he was no spring chicken. Lazarus helped him up, and they walked together, followed by Peter, Lydia, Leah, Peter Jr., and Paul, to greet the visitor. It turned out there was none other than Uncle Amos McKinnon. Amos, said Angus. Is it really you? I da, answered the buckskin clad wearing man. It's me. The 30-year-old hugged his father for the first time in 12 years. It almost felt like an eternity. When Angus released his only son, Lydia hugged her younger brother, tears falling down her cheeks. Her husband and sons patiently waited their turn while Leah hid behind her grandfather. I thought we would never see you again, said Lydia. I have so much to tell, sis, said Amos. It's good to see you again, Peter. Peter Buchanan shook his long lost brother in law's hand and almost winced at his grip. You've gotten stronger over the years, he said. I'll take that as a compliment. And Amos stopped and looked at the three nephews and niece for a moment. I see the three lads I once knew in the men who stand before me. Welcome home, Uncle Amos, said Peter Jr. and Paul simultaneously. Amos shook both their hands and was impressed with their grips. Lazarus stood there in awe for a moment as he looked at the buckskin clad figure who he hasn't seen since he was 4 years old. Let me look at you, Lazarus, said Amos. Last time I saw you, I was still able to carry you over my shoulders. I remember, Uncle Amos, said Lazarus. Is this what the soldiers in the army wear? Amos laughed. Good God, no, lad. I left the army back in '06. Before he explained further, Amos and turned to Leah. And just who is this pretty lass that stands before me? I'm Leah. You have your mother's eyes, said Amos. You were 2 years old the last time I saw you. Granddad said you went off to the army, said Leah. I did. But if you've been out of the army for about 4 years, son, said Angus, where have you been? Trapping, answered Amos. I've been living in the Rocky Mountains, making a living as a trapper. Rocky Mountains, said Lazarus. You mean west of Mississippi where Lewis and Clark went? Aye, nephew, answered Amos, and boy, do I have stories to tell you.